There's a magazine that I subscribe to that is called the Presbyterian Outlook. And I try to read it on a fairly regular basis as a way of keeping up on all that's going on out there in Presbyterian land. I seldom make it through an entire issue, but there is one page that I always try to look at. It's a list of all the transitions in the life of the church, all the ministers that have changed positions or who have retired or who have died in the previous few months. And I like to read it just to see if there's anyone there that I know, especially people that over the years I might otherwise have lost track of. And that's where I saw recently the news that the Reverend Cal Bailey had died. That's Cal Bailey, not Carl Bailey. Carl's still with us, thank goodness. I knew Cal years ago when we were both in Memphis Presbytery. He wasn't anything I would call a close friend, more really just an acquaintance. In fact, I can't recall ever having had but one conversation with him. But it was one of those conversations that you have that you never forget, something that stays with you. In his case, at least in part, because it was so utterly unexpected. For although his name was Calvin Bailey, and you might expect a Presbyterian minister named Calvin to have been named for John Calvin, in this case, the more appropriate namesake would have been Calvin Coolidge, since, like that president, Cal Bailey was a man of very few words. The one conversation that we did have took place at one of the ministers' retreats that was periodically sponsored by our presbytery. That night, the two of us just so happened to call it an evening a little earlier than everyone else. And while we were walking back to our cabin, much to my surprise, Cal started talking. And he didn't stop talking for a long time. He talked for hours about how unhappy he was as a minister, how much he regretted ever having chosen our vocation, that from the time he had finished seminary until that moment, some 30-plus years later, it had just been one fight after another in the church, and he was sick and tired of it. And he wasn't exaggerating either. His years of ministry had indeed been one long fight. You see, Cal had finished seminary in the 1950s, just as the civil rights struggle was coming to the fore, and it dramatically affected the church in the South, particularly the Deep South, where we both lived. And then before things, and particularly before tempers had had time to cool off, there was the Vietnam War and the deep divisions that it provoked in our society and in the church. And then it was women's ordination, particularly the ordination of women as ministers, which came to the South a little later than it did the North. And then it was the fight over reunion, which again was considerably more contentious in the South than it was elsewhere. And then, even as we spoke that night, this was in the early 1990s, there were the first stirrings of conflict over the whole question of gay ordination. And that was 20 years ago, and of course the fight is still going on, as anyone who's been involved in denominational politics the last 10 or 15 years knows painfully well. And to someone who enters the ministry expecting everything to be sweetness and light, expecting everyone to love each other and no one ever to utter a harsh word in anger, which I suspect is what Cal thought ministry was going to be like, for him to discover the exact opposite, to experience the reality of prolonged conflict and division, conflict that very often was quite bitter, could not help but have been deeply disconcerting and profoundly disillusioning. And it was pretty clear that 30 years of that had taken its toll. had pretty much taken everything Cal had to give, and as I suspect it had for a number of other ministers in his generation. It wasn't long after that conversation that Cal retired, and I sincerely hope that in the remaining 20 or so years of his life that he finally found some measure of peace and rest from his labors. I felt sorry for Cal, but the fact is that anyone who knows anything about the history of the church knows that the conflict and dissension of the past 40 or 50 years is nothing new, that there's always been conflict in the church, and at times that conflict has been of considerably greater magnitude than anything any one of us has ever experienced. All you'd have to do is just take a look even at the history of the Presbyterian Church in this country, where our history of conflict and division goes back to the 1740s. A conflict that, in fact, tore apart this very congregation when numerous of its members withdrew to form the Second Presbyterian Church just a few blocks away. Not because Philadelphia suddenly needed another Presbyterian church, but because the Presbyterians here could no longer stand to be in each other's company. Indeed, I hope you appreciate the rich irony of the white marble plaque that's hanging on the wall right over there, hanging on the wall here of the First Presbyterian Church, because that plaque, which honors Gilbert Tennent and George Whitefield, would certainly not have been welcome in the First Church of 1750. At Second Church, they were heroes. At First Church, they were just troublemakers. And things weren't much better in the 19th century either. For then the distinguished pastor of Second Church, Ashbel Green, who went on, sorrowfully, to become president of Princeton University, filed heresy charges against the distinguished pastor of First Church, a man by the name of Albert Barnes, and did so not once, but twice, hardly intended to promote inter-congregational unity. As unfortunate as it may be, conflict in the church is nothing new. It's certainly nothing, sadly, unusual. In fact, all you have to do is read a few pages into 1 Corinthians to realize that the conflict has been there from the very beginnings of the church. There's never been a time when there wasn't conflict in the church, which is why there's also never been a time when we didn't long for the day when there wouldn't be conflict, when the conflict would at last cease and we could all be one. And that's what Jesus' prayer in John 17 is all about, a small portion of which we read this morning as our gospel lesson. As I said, Jesus offered this prayer on the night before his death, in the hours following the Last Supper, as he prepared his disciples for his imminent departure. And his prayer for them that night was that they would be one. And not just them, but all who would come to believe ultimately through their efforts, so that all believers might not just be one, but might be, Jesus says, completely one. Now, Jesus didn't pray for unity because conflict is unpleasant, and the church would be better off without it, though that's certainly true. And it wasn't just that unity in the church is nicer for everyone involved, though that too is certainly true. He prayed for unity because it was that, in the absence of Jesus himself, that would be the sign, not just a sign, but would be the sign to the world that Jesus was really and truly who they said he was. The sign to the world that Jesus was the Son of God. That is to say, the unity of the church was going to be the miracle that would convince the world. And Jesus knew even then that it would take a miracle for the church to be one. And it's precisely that miracle that Jesus prays for here. He prays for a miracle because the church, just like the world around us, is made up of sinful human beings who most of the time would rather fight than eat. Our first lesson this morning from the book of Acts is a reminder of just how contentious is this world in which we live, and especially how contentious it was back in those days. Now, the part of this story that we usually focus on, and certainly what Luke intends to be the main part of the story, is what happens to Paul and Silas after they've been thrown into prison. But today I want to look at what happened just before that, what it was that had gotten them thrown into prison in the first place. As you might remember from last week, Paul and Silas are in Philippi, which, though in Macedonia, was a Roman colony, meaning that it was largely populated by former Roman soldiers. And walking down the street one day, Paul, who Luke tells us was annoyed by something someone had said, says something back, and it promptly starts a riot. A riot that developed along ethnic lines that eventually led to all kinds of accusations and eventually to a crackdown by the Roman authorities. Because if there was one thing that the Romans didn't tolerate, it was public unrest, and especially public unrest along ethnic lines. They didn't tolerate it, but because it was a very serious threat to public order throughout the empire, which is why they then threw Paul and Silas into jail. Though even that was probably as much to protect them from the mob as it was to punish them. It's simply a good example of how contentious life was in that world, where a single comment could result in a public riot and a crackdown by the Roman authorities. Well, as they say, some things never change. Because while that kind of ethnic conflict might be mercifully absent from most of our lives these days, it is still all too typical of life in many parts of our world, including some parts of the world from which some of us might have come. In just the past few weeks, the newspapers and TV have been full of news about deadly conflicts in places like Burma, conflict between Buddhists, of all people, and Muslims, conflicts in India between Hindus and Muslims, and in Nigeria between Christians and Muslims, to say nothing of the ordinary run-of-the-mill day-to-day conflict along religious, ethnic, and racial lines that goes on in practically every country of the world every single day. Now, granted, the extent to which we have successfully insulated ourselves, at least most of the time, from that kind of conflict and suffering, often blinds us, I think, to just how pervasive it is in so many parts of the world, and frankly, in parts of the world not very far from you and me. In fact, in parts of this city, not very far from where you and I live. I encountered a staggering statistic just this past week, which sadly is all too true of Philadelphia. And that was that a young African-American male growing up today, a young black man growing up in America today, is twice as likely to die as was an American soldier during World War II. Now think about that. That's astonishing. The fact that it was actually safer to be an American soldier in the most destructive war the world has ever known as it is to be a young black man growing up in our country today. How can that be? I think we have a hard time comprehending that level of violence and what it's like for people to have to live under those conditions. Personally, I think that's one of the reasons we have such a hard time with the book of Revelation, because it is one of the books of the New Testament that is very much born of the knowledge of suffering. Revelation is a book written by a person who knows what it is to suffer, who has seen suffering. And knowing that suffering, he has experienced its dual legacy, both the longing for peace and the end of such suffering, but also a thirst for vengeance against those responsible for the suffering, a vengeance that all too often simply sows the seeds of the next round of conflict and its suffering. And that combination makes us very uncomfortable. But it should also be a reminder to us of the importance of our proclaiming and sharing with the world a gospel of unity and love. Because in a world too often torn apart by violence and hatred, the gospel are words that need to be heard. Unfortunately, I think we've lost the confidence that earlier generations had in just how big a difference the gospel of Jesus Christ can make in this world. Come to think, it's not all that important to share that gospel with others, but it is. Because in a world like ours where there is so much division and so much conflict and so much suffering, anything that we in the church can do to break down the barriers that divide people and to promote understanding among different people, anything we can do, beginning with getting along with one another, will bring that much closer the day when we finally will be completely one. And my friends, that day cannot come any too soon. Come, Lord Jesus. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, to whom be all glory and honor, now and forevermore.